We're delighted to have Bret Stephens join us this morning as our honored guest. And as many of you know, Bret has been a columnist for the New York Times since 2017. And prior to that, he had a long career with the Wall Street Journal as an editor in New York and in Europe and as a columnist. In 2013, he received the Pulitzer Prize for commentary for, quote, his incisive columns on American foreign policy and domestic politics, often enlivened by a contrarian twist, end of quote. Throughout his career, Bret has been a vocal supporter of Israel. And in 2002, while he was still in his 20s, he was named editor-in-chief of the Jerusalem Post and served there for 2 years during the height of the Intifada, the Second Intifada. It was during that time, Bret, if you might recall, I first met you in your office in Jerusalem. I was accompanying the first cohort of students from the Jewish Week's Right On for Israel program. The program was for 11th and 12th graders to educate and prepare them for the Middle East debate that they would find when they got to campus. And Bret was kind enough to meet with our group, and he continued to support the program over the next 2 decades, frequently meeting with and speaking to our students in New York, and most recently was the keynote speaker this spring at the graduation of Right On's last class. Bret has been a frequent contributor to Commentary magazine, and in 2021, he became the founding editor-in-chief of Sapir, a journal of Jewish conversations, sponsored by the Maimonides Foundation, which I highly recommend. I could go on with Bret's bio, but in the interest of time, we'll get started. So welcome, Bret, formally, and for joining us. It's great to have you here virtually. And I guess I'm your Gail Collins for today. Just to start, when I found that quote cited by the Pulitzer Committee, I looked up the word contrarian. And the dictionary defines it as one who's opposite in nature, counter, opposed, unwilling to accept control or advice. Is that you?
Well, that's what my mother would say I am. So that must be right, Gary. It's nice to see you, and it's an honor to follow in such a distinguished list of speakers in your parents' memory. Yeah, I have been I'm a bit of a born contrarian. When I was in high school, I started a rabble-rousing alternative student newspaper. In a somewhat amusing quirk of history, the editor of the mainstream student newspaper, although he was a few years ahead of me, was a guy named Joe Kahn, who's now the editor-in-chief of the New York Times. So I've always been sort of on the opposite side of a lot of things, and I think that tradition continues to the present.
Although you've joined forces of late, so that's nice.
Well, I'm in opinion, and I'm the right-wing guy in the left-wing paper. So
right. So I have a trick question for you. Can you name the country I'm thinking of? It has a dominant political leader who is in seeking to stay out of jail for a variety of alleged criminal acts, has deeply divided his country, and is feared by many to be a threat to its democratic future.
Well, I don't know how tricky a question that is, but
well, whichever one you say, I'll say I was thinking of the other one, but go ahead.
Well, I think I don't think if this is the essence of your question, I don't think Donald Trump is running for president to try to stay out of jail, but he has other motives. But if you're thinking about the other guy, I'm happy to talk about him as well.
All right. So
aren't most politicians running for office to stay out of jail?
That's true. They try and get a head start. Although, you know, Natan Sharansky famously says that he's different from every other politician. He said, I went to jail first, and then I became a politician. So.
No, it's true. And Israel does have a somewhat illustrious history of putting former leaders into prison, which says something. I think it's an interesting contrast with Iran, in which all of the current leaders will hopefully end up in prison, and all of the people currently in prison will hopefully end up in power. But that's
Yeah,
another conversation.
okay. So on the Israel front, you wrote a column in July called Israel's self-inflicted wound. And you said there could be a compromise on this judicial problem that has really divided the country. And you wrote, Israel wouldn't be in this national meltdown if Netanyahu weren't trying to wangle out of his criminal indictment by holding on to power in his coalition of the bigoted, the corrupt, the dependent, and the extreme. A statesman sacrifices himself for his nation. A demagogue sacrifices his nation for himself. It looks like we're in for a showdown possibly this week with the Supreme Court in Israel dealing with the reasonableness case. And it seems like either way they rule, the other side could take to the streets, and we could really have some chaos because it's an unprecedented situation. So we are in uncharted territory, and I just wonder your thoughts about what's going down now.
Well, a couple of things. I think this is one of the most needless crises in Israeli history. When Israelis went to the polls 10 months ago, I don't think too many of them were thinking that the most important issue facing the country was the question of the role of the judiciary. That has been an issue for going on 30 years, and it's a legitimate issue, but it wasn't the primary one. And I don't think the prime minister, Mr. Netanyahu, would have put his political weight behind it had it not been for his own personal legal predicament and for the need to assemble a fairly extreme coalition by the standards of Israeli politics, certainly involving some very unsavory people. So here we are. I hope that the Supreme Court does not overrule the Knesset. I also hope that the Knesset has the good sense to end the legislative reform where it is now, which is to say the passage of one of the four main planks of the original reform, the reasonableness case. Look, I'm not. I'm awake to the argument that the Supreme Court arrogated to itself too many powers in the last 30 years without ever obtaining really the consent of the governed. They just went ahead and did it for reasons that have a variety of justifications. But I am against trying to settle fundamental issues on narrow party line votes. So the proper way forward is the way that's being advanced by people like Bougie Herzog, the president of the country, which is to try to achieve some kind of consensus and to move forward on that basis. The prime minister has said that everything going forward would be on the basis of consensus, but he's broken his word in the past, and he might break it in the future. All that being said, Gary, I want to underscore I remain fundamentally optimistic about the future of Israel. People talk about the country as if it's on the verge of national suicide, but anyone here with a long memory who's followed Israeli politics over its many years can remember the bitter debates over disengagement from Gaza, or the Oslo Accords, or the Lebanon War, or going all the way back to German reparations in the 1950s. So Israel has a pattern of having these bitter disputes, but argument is in the bloodstream of the Jewish people, and this will continue in Israel too.
So in terms of American Jews at this point, many respected people in Israel, including some of our colleagues there, are saying that the best way to support Israel today is to resist the government, and are calling on American Jews to speak up. Do you think American Jews should take a stand and speak out in terms of our organizational leaders or individuals in speaking out against the government?
Look, I have opposed the judicial plans for the reasons I outlined just a second ago. And so if I'm going to speak out through the bullhorn of my column in the New York Times, every American Jew is entitled to his opinion, and organizations are entitled to form their views. And I've generally made the point that American Jews should be more reticent on security issues, just because it's not our lives or usually our children's lives that hang in the balance. The subject of democracy and checks and balances and individual rights, I think on that subject we have much more to contribute to the Jewish conversation, the global Jewish conversation, than we do on narrower questions of security. But I want to sort of push back against a little of what I see as a bit of hysteria in certain quarters of the American Jewish community, that this is the end of Israeli democracy, that the country is now a de facto dictatorship, that they want to have nothing to do with it. That is not just nonsense, it's dangerous. It's nonsense because what you have in this debate is an argument between one version of democracy and another version of democracy. We don't want, and American liberals in particular should be aware of the fact that just as we don't like the Supreme Court arrogating to itself decisions which we think should be the rightful province of legislatures or of the people, right? We wouldn't wish the same on Israel. At the same time, we believe in a kind of a checks and balances. So Israel's going to hash this argument out over the next months or even years. And I think our role is to be that of, the loving and concerned brother, not the scornful and dismissive, ex-spouse here. We have to be sure that the criticism is saturated with love and not contempt. And so that's my caution to American Jewish organizations, because the risk of contempt grows large.
Okay, so turning to the U.S. For a moment, and as a never Trump conservative, you've written often and pretty sharply about how dangerous Donald Trump is and how mainstream Republicans refuse to speak out against him. Here's a quote from a piece you wrote in June called "Lock Him Up." His entire presidency was a drunken joyride with a reckless driver careening around hairpin turns at high speed. And another Trump presidency would be an orgy of petty political retribution and reckless policymaking that would make his first term seem by comparison responsible and tame. How do you really feel about him, Bret? But beyond that, what are your thoughts about a 2024 election where it seems like most Americans are troubled by having the choice of Biden or Trump?
I think it says something about the broken nature of our politics that we're hurtling towards an election with two candidates whom most of the country dislikes, or at least doesn't prefer. And it says that, one of the things it says is that we have hyperpartisanship within parties and insufficient civic engagement outside of those parties. There are lots of specific reasons why that is happening, and I could go on at length about them. But I think there's a larger question about the broken nature of our politics, which really goes to kind of a broken nature of not just American democracy, but American society. I mean, one of the things that I find extremely dispiriting is that 40 years or 50 years of teaching contempt for the institutions of the United States has paid off in at least one candidate, Mr. Trump, who's contemptuous of those institutions. Decades of failing to teach critical thinking has left us open in a frightening way to conspiracy theorists. And I don't just mean Trump, I also mean, to me, the frightening popularity of Robert F. Kennedy Jr. So, we complain about our politics, but in a democracy, ultimately, that complaint is an indictment of the people who generate the democracy. And I wish we could find ways to do better. But part of the solution, Gary, is not simply, quote, fixing politics by changing gerrymanders or other kind of fixes at the constitutional level. They have to begin at a civic level as well. They begin with, I think, American universities that have lost sight of what they're supposed to be about. They begin at the fact that national service doesn't exist, and we barely recognize each other across party or ideological divides. They begin with the sense that Americans have a diminished and I think vulgar idea of their own history, which gives them a kind of a vulgar sense of what it ought to be about and what the opportunities are. And by the way, this is a bipartisan indictment. I mean, for 50 years, it was really the left that was teaching contempt for the American Constitution, contempt for American foundational ideals, the sense that, the argument was that it was just a bunch of rich white guys trying to entrench their own interests at the expense of the people. And lo and behold, the person who actually gets the most political advantage out of that happens to be Donald Trump. So people have to be careful about the things that they teach, because it might hurt them in ways they never expected.
Yeah. So I mentioned stuff here, the journal that you edit, and each issue has a theme, and the latest issue is the theme of anti-Semitism. Mm-hmm. Before we get into a little bit about that, I wondered if you could share with us a bit of your family history, because I know it's an interesting one that includes a grandfather escaping anti-Semitism in Europe, and you end up growing up primarily in Mexico City. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that, and did you experience anti-Semitism personally?
I mean, I have a like just about every Jewish family. There's a kind of a rich history on my mother's side. My mother is descended from a fairly illustrious rabbinical family in Lithuania named Grodzinski. Some people may have heard of a rabbi named Chaim Ozer Grodzinski. I sometimes see his portrait, particularly in Orthodox synagogues. He was the chief rabbi of Vilna. He was my great-grandfather's uncle. My great-grandfather, born Israel Grodzinski, became the black sheep of the family, changed his name to Ivan, was arrested by the Bolsheviks in 1918 and never heard from again, sending his wife and 4 children into flight. My grandmother, after coming of age or spending her early years in Moscow, spent her later years in Berlin until 1933, and then fled to Italy before the race laws. My mother was born effectively in hiding in 1940 and came to the States as a displaced person 10 years later after the war, thanks to Harry Truman. On my father's side, my grandfather was born in Kishinev and fled the pogrom in 1903 and came to America, and then eventually went to Mexico, where he met my grandmother, a Jewish girl from Queens, who had gone to Mexico to paint with a guy named Diego Rivera. You might have heard of him, and his wife, Frida Kahlo. And that's where my father was born, and a family business began there. So that's how I came to be raised in Mexico City. So it like a lot of Jewish families, it sort of involves a lot of countries and a lot of exiles and a lot of good luck along the way.
As far as anti-Semitism in your own life, either in Mexico?
Yeah, I mean, look, in Mexico, there was a certain amount of low-grade, I guess you'd call it Catholic anti-Semitism. It wasn't, you could hear it expressed here and there, but it wasn't, it was sort of unthinking more than anything else. There's anti-Semitism and there's anti-Semitism. There's anti-Semitism that sort of thinks that Jews are, shysters, and there's anti-Semitism that thinks that Jews should be wiped off the map, and they exist on a continuum. The real anti-Semitism that I first experienced was just after 9/11, I was working for the Wall Street Journal based in Brussels. And I have a vivid memory of coming back. One thing that happens when you're a Jew named Stephens is people don't.
You get to hear more.
You're Jewish and you hear things that you might otherwise hear. So one of the things that I was very struck by was hearing sophisticated Europeans. These are not yokels; these are or far right wingers, but sophisticated Europeans with jobs in the European Union saying that 9/11 wouldn't have happened but for Israel. And that's really when a big light bulb went off in my head, and it's what ultimately led to my departure from Brussels for Jerusalem and the editorship of the Jerusalem Post. I've often said there's anti-Semitism you see and there's anti-Semitism you sense. And like every proverbial iceberg, the anti-Semitism we sense, I think, is the much larger mass lurking just below the water.
Yeah. I've read that one of the reasons you took the Jerusalem Post position was that you were upset with mainstream American media reporting on Jews in Israel. And I wonder, what was your primary complaint then, and how would you rate the media 2 decades later?
Well, I thought a lot of the journalism was lazy and sloppy. Some of it was outright dishonest and, grossly tendentious. And there's a kind of an intersection there between the laziness. The laziness is the kind of a certain type of reporting that scrupulously avoids trying to look at cause and effect, right? Or distinguish between victim and aggressor, or doesn't raise commonsensical questions about the nature of certain conflicts. And what I saw a lot of, this is now going back more than 20 years to the turn of the century, was a kind of like, well, there's a cycle of violence in the Middle East, and if Israel only didn't escalate, the Palestinians wouldn't escalate either. Anyone with eyes could see that the Second Intifada was a planned event by Yasser Arafat and the people in Fatah looking for an excuse to gain by violence all of the concessions that they were demanding, including the right of return. And I just thought that was missing in a lot of reporting. A lot of reporting, Gary, can be accurate as to facts and yet be predictively worthless. What I mean by that is just think of a very different situation. Think of the reporting by American news media in Japan in the 1980s. American reporters sort of credulously went to Tokyo, and the narrative at the time was, well, Japan is soon going to be the #1 economy in the world because they have a method of economic organization with, much more government oversight, which is, the narrative was, it was superior to the kind of laissez-faire economic model of the United States. And so they'd go to companies like Sony or car companies like Honda and say, well, look, these companies are so much better, make such better products than their American equivalents, which narrowly speaking was probably true. Sony TVs were better, Hondas were better. But what was missing was the sense that the Japanese economic miracle was a giant bubble based on an inflated real estate market, which then burst, and Japan has not been a major factor or the dominant factor in economics for 30 years. Same story, by the way, happened in China over the last 15 or 20 years. I've been writing stories out of my nose or out of my ears saying China's a bubble that's going to burst. So you can always find what, any journalist worth his salt can always find facts to fit his narrative. But good journalism requires you to sort of challenge those foundational narratives and look for countervailing points of data which tell you that something with the narrative is wrong. And I saw very little of that when I went to Israel in much of the mainstream reporting. In addition to which, there was a lot of it that was just outright tendentious or slanderous or kind of slavishly following the party line of the Palestinian Authority. So I tried to serve as a bit of a check against that.
Yeah, and you did. Just a reminder, folks, so Bret will take some questions in a few minutes, and so please put any questions that you have on the chat, and Dove will take a look and select them in a couple of minutes. I see the hours going by quickly, and so I just want to. When I was reading some of the Sapir articles about in the anti-Semitism issue, it seemed like there was a thread that was running through several of them, pardon me, about the need for, I guess, a more nuanced balancing act for both American and Israeli Jews in dealing with their identity and with some of the serious issues that we and they face. The notion that, you know, American Jews are both privileged and have economic and political power, but they're also a vulnerable minority and feeling the threat of increasing anti-Semitism. And for Israel, I mean, you had a piece called "Israel is a World Power," which is true, of course, in terms of its, you know, the strong economy and military and other places, but also facing an existential threat from Iran, and more recently concerns about a liberal democracy. I guess my question is, you see this as sort of the Jewish condition of, you know, constantly balancing being confident and ever vigilant, you know that I think I've mentioned before, the Jewish telegram that starts says, "Start worrying, details to follow." You know, is this just the way it is?
Look, you know, a point that I've been making for the last year at least is that in 1922, the most powerful man in Germany was Walter Rathenauer. The most famous scientist, not just in Germany, but in the world, was Albert Einstein. The greatest doctor in Europe was Otto von Meyerhoff. And the most important philosopher in the world was Edmund Husserl, all German Jews. Well, I guess Albert was Swiss, but that's 1922. And 11 years later, the Nazis came to power. So there's a distressing history that our zenith historically has also been our precipice. There's a kind of a darkness at noon quality. So when I think about the United States today, it's notable that the chief of staff to the president, the head of the Senate Majority Leader, the secretaries of state, treasury, and homeland security, all Jews. It's just quite an extraordinary achievement. But we should have in the back of our mind the constant possibility that these things can go away very quickly, in part because, you know, anti-Semitism, and this is a point Deborah Lipstadt, one of your former speakers, has made, is not a function of punching down. It thinks of itself as a form of punching up. And so when Jews have influence and position and financial power, but they don't have the political power to secure that influence and position, they become exceptionally vulnerable. And this is, by the way, not true only of Jews. You think of the Indians in Uganda during the Idi Amin reign, or the Chinese in Malaysia and Indonesia. Hannah Arendt makes this point in The Origins of Totalitarianism, that nothing is so vulnerable as economic power without political power. So I'm always worried about the position of the Jews in any society where they don't have ultimate political power. So Israel is an exception here, but there are currents in American cultural life that should be disturbing to American Jews, not because they're anti-Semitic in themselves, but because they can often lead to anti-Semitic conclusions. I mean, just to give you one example, you know, the rise of conspiracy thinking in the United States, whether it's about COVID or the 2020 election or Barack Obama's birth certificate, you know, none of those are overtly anti-Semitic. But if you think of anti-Semitism as just another conspiracy theory, then you have to worry about what it says about America, that so many Americans are prone to be conspiracy theorists. It means that they might be disposed to believe in anti-Jewish conspiracy theories. There's a trend in American cultural life, especially in academia, that despises intellectual heterodoxy, despises consensus breakers, contrarians, to use a word we started this conversation with. But Jews are almost instinctive contrarians. I mean, it's really very much in our cultural DNA. So are Jewish thinkers going to suffer under a dispensation that despises contrarianism, even if it's not directed specifically against Jews? I suspect they might. So there are these trends in American life, this kind of cavalier use of the word privilege as a substitute and an invidious substitute for what we used to call success in America. That's another trend in American cultural life that isn't anti-Semitic in its intention, but could be anti-Semitic in its effects. So all of these things are things that I really worry about. I'm much more confident about Israel because I think Israel has reserves of deep cultural resiliency that are going to carry it through successive crises. And people worry about Iran today, but 50 years ago, when I was born, the great fear was, Egypt and Syria, just as 25 years earlier it had been the rest of the Arab world. Israel is a very astute country that knows how to defend itself, and because it has less of a margin for error, it's prone to making fewer mistakes. Not to say they can't make mistakes, but they make fewer of them because there's just less indulgence of outright idiocy as there is in the United States. But if you had to ask me, where Jewry is going to be flourishing in 75 years, the United States or Israel, I'm pretty confident it's going to be Israel. I worry a great deal about the future of American Jewry.
Yeah, there is a lot to explore here, and I just want to before we take a couple of questions, I want to give you a shot at maybe a message to this audience of Jews in a small town congregation and friends around the country, and on the eve of Rosh Hashanah. Just what would your primary takeaway be for us?
Oh,
not a sermon, but
well, I hope the new year is very sweet. Look, I think the Jewish community actually spends a little too much time talking about anti-Semitism. Not to say that it isn't. I mean, here's Sapir. We're writing about anti-Semitism, but the real challenge for the Jewish community isn't so much to fight anti-Semitism. It is to give future generations a reason to remain Jews. Again, go back 100 years. There was a thriving Swedish American community in the United States. Newspapers in Swedish Lutheran churches, especially in places like Minnesota, all over the place. Strong Swedish identity, both ethnically, linguistically, and religiously. All gone. I mean, people might say, oh, I'm 1/4 Swedish and 1/4 Irish and, half whatever. But there is no Swedish American identity for all intents and purposes today. And there is no guarantee that that isn't also the future of Jewish Americans going forward outside of the Orthodox and ultra-Orthodox communities. More than 60% of young Jews marry outside the faith. Among non-Orthodox Jews, non-Orthodox Jewish women have the lowest birth rates of any ethnic group in the United States. I'm not saying that pejoratively. People have a right to have the family sizes they want, But if you're not going to marry a Jew, and if you're not going to have children, the result is there isn't going to be a Jewish community, or it's going to be that much more attenuated going forward. So our responsibility, those of us who are, of my generation or older, is to give young Jews a sense that being Jewish isn't just an aspect of their identity, but it's the most fortunate, the most terrific, the most miraculous aspect of their identity, that they somehow lucked out and got to be links in a chain that stretches back more than 3,000 years and connects them to an amazingly resilient civilization. Beyond the question of simple religion or simple ethnicity or simple culture, a civilization that has consistently produced results for the world which are astounding. If some philanthropist gave me $200 million and said, what do you want to do with it? I'd say, I'd like to create a museum of Jewish ideas. This is not my idea. It's actually Barry Weiss's father's idea. Lou Weiss from Squirrel Hill in Pittsburgh, a lovely man. The Weekend, for example, you're welcome. We gave you that. You talk about social justice. Social justice is a profoundly Jewish idea. Monotheism, peoplehood, universal literacy, one thing after another that we now take for granted are foundational Jewish concepts. And that's amazing. And by the way, we continue to produce this up until the present moment. Everyone is now talking about artificial intelligence and Chat GPT, brought to you by a nice Jewish boy named Sam Altman, right? Before that, we were talking about social media, brought to you by another sort of nice Jewish boy named Mark Zuckerberg, right? I mean, it's an incredibly fruitful civilization. And it is tragic if we aren't able to show younger people that being a part of the civilization, and they can be a part of it in different ways. They don't have to be ultra-Orthodox, or they don't have to be one thing or another, but to be not just aware, but knowledgeable about what that civilization is one of the best things they can do with their lives. So that's my message for the new year, right? Talk to your children and grandchildren that you don't do it for the sake of your ancestors alone, or even primarily. You do it for the sake of yourself and your own posterity, right? Because what you are passing along is a treasure. It's invaluable, right? So it's like having, I don't know, Fabergé eggs up in your attic, right? Fix the roof so you don't ruin the Fabergé eggs, and that's my message.
So Bret, I know you call yourself a secular Jew, but I think you missed your rabbinic calling, and I want to thank you. But before you go, we want to open it up, Dove, if we could take a couple of questions for Bret, and he'll understand that brevity will reign here, and so take it away, Dove.
Okay, one was, do you see any realistic possibility of alternatives to Biden and or Trump running for president? And actually following up on that, who would be your first choice?
I actually, if I had to place a very modest bet, I would bet that Biden will not be the Democratic nominee next year. And I don't know how that will come about, but people should remember that let's see, it's September. So in September of 1967, it was universally assumed that LBJ would be the Democratic nominee in 68. Then he was challenged by Gene McCarthy, opening the way for Bobby Kennedy, and LBJ stepped back. And I still think that there are a lot of very good reasons why not only Biden should step back, but will step back. With Trump, I'm in it's a despair, because as a lifelong moderate conservative, but still a conservative, the idea that the Republican Party has been hijacked by this character is just personally upsetting. For all of you who are Democrats, you can I understand your dismay and disbelief about what's happened to the Republican Party, but think about what happened to us never Trumpers. We got thrown out of our own house. The argument, look, Trump's argument fundamentally is he can beat Joe Biden. If Joe Biden isn't the nominee, let's say Gretchen Whitmer, the governor of Michigan, is the nominee, then Trump's case that he can win is a much more slender case. That might bring an opening to someone like Nikki Haley, who performed very well in her debate or a couple weeks ago, to come in, or maybe even someone like Glenn Youngkin, who's been clearly waiting in the wings and seeing if there's an opportunity for him. But sadly, I just think Trump is going to bulldoze his way to the nomination, and there will be again, which is depressing, because every society, every healthy democracy needs a healthy conservative party. Even if you're not a conservative yourself, even if you're a lifelong liberal or progressive, you, somewhere in the back of your mind, you have to say to yourself, there's got to be a conservative party that's run by the likes of the John McCains and Mitt Romneys of the world, whom you can at least live with when they're president and they don't nauseate you, even if you disagree with them. But right now, we don't have a healthy conservative party in America. And that's one of the reasons I stay conservative, because someone has to speak for the side.
Bill, I think we have time for one more.
Okay. Well, I mean, I guess you touched on this a little bit. It sounded almost like the best response to anti-Semitism is pro-Semitism, if you will. But someone asked, what do you think is the most singular, important, and effective response to Jew hatred or anti-Semitism on electronic social media?
Get off electronic social media.
There you go.
It's a sore. No, I really think that the more we divest these platforms of our attention, the less powerful they are. When anti-Semites want nothing more than to goad others into responding, because it enhances their power. And so, the great, I said this at the end of my essay on anti-Semitism, and so I'll just say it one more time. I say, I make the case for Jewish thriving, and then I say, if we ever get the kind of Jewish thriving that we need, it might lead to more anti-Semitism, not less. It would certainly give those who hate us that much more to envy, but it would strengthen our self-confidence, attract friends and admirers, give us positive reasons to endure and flourish, widen our margin of safety, fortify our sense of Jewish pride, and offer the ultimate riposte to those who seek to diminish and destroy us. We are still here, better and stronger than ever, is always a fine reply to anti-Semitism. Maybe that's the right place to end.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay. Well, before we do close, I just want to thank Dov again for serving as host and engineer today. And
my pleasure.
His song, L'Dor Vador, from generation to generation, we heard, that's the theme of the stained glass window in memory of my father at Knesset Israel, and really the theme of these annual memorial programs, and what we heard from Bret today. For those of you who'd like to stay online after the program to chat with each other, Dov will keep this Zoom open for about 10 or 15 minutes. And on behalf of our family, thanks to each of you for being with us today in honor of our parents. It means a great deal to us, to our family. And thank you, Bret, for your presence here, for your always provocative insights and your friendship. So we wish each of you a new year of good health and joy and resilience, and a year of peace. And may we all be together for happier occasions. So shalom, and thank you, and Shana Tova.
And I hope the Orioles win today.
And every day.
Amen.